Poor mechanic sat at wrong table, met the Emperor's paralyzed daughter. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. The grand dining hall of the Imperial Palace stretched 300 meters in every direction, its crystalline ceiling reflecting the light of 1,000 hovering luminaries. And somewhere in that ocean of pristine white tables and elegant alien dignitaries, a human mechanic covered in grease stains was about to make the worst seating mistake of his life. Ethan Cole had never wanted to be here in the first place. The invitation had arrived at his workshop 3 days ago, delivered by a silver drone that nearly gave him a heart attack when it materialized through his wall. The holographic message was formal, excessively so, written in that flowery Valerian script that his translator could barely parse. Something about a galactic unity celebration, attendance mandatory for all sentient beings currently residing within the Valerian Empire's capital city, dress code formal. Ethan had stared at the message for a full minute before laughing so hard he dropped his plasma wrench. Formal attire. He owned exactly one outfit that wasn't covered in hydraulic fluid or plasma residue. A simple black suit he'd bought for his sister's wedding 5 years ago. It still fit, barely, though the shoulders were tight from years of wrestling with stubborn machinery. He'd tried to refuse, naturally, but the drone had simply repeated the word mandatory in 17 different languages until Ethan gave up and accepted. So here he was, standing at the edge of the most opulent room he'd ever seen, watching aliens in clothing that probably cost more than his entire workshop glide between tables with the kind of grace that only came from generations of selective breeding and etiquette training. The Valorians were tall, elegant beings with crystalline skin that refracted light in mesmerizing patterns. They moved like living sculptures, each gesture precise and deliberate. Scattered among them were representatives from dozens of other species. The hulking Bronther with their stone-like hides, the ethereal Leminians who seemed to barely touch the ground, the insectoid chitters with their compound eyes gleaming in the ambient light. And then there was Ethan, 5 foot 10 inches of human mechanic who smelled faintly of machine oil despite 3 showers. A Valerian attendant, her crystalline features arranged in what might have been a polite smile, gestured toward the vast sea of tables. Each one was marked with a holographic designation that floated above its center, displaying numbers and symbols in the Valerian script. Ethan's translator struggled to keep up, flickering between partial translations. Table 47. Table 92. Table 218. Somewhere in this chaos was his assigned seat, probably tucked away in the farthest corner where they put the unimportant guests. His invitation had specified Table 17. He'd memorized the number because it was the only part of the message his translator had rendered clearly. 17. Simple enough. He pushed through the crowd, murmuring apologies in broken Valerian as he bumped into dignitaries who looked at him with barely concealed disdain. One elderly Valerian actually recoiled when Ethan's sleeve brushed against his ornate robe, as if the human might somehow contaminate him through fabric. The tables blurred together as Ethan navigated the maze. His translator kept flickering, the constant stream of alien languages and script overwhelming its processing capacity. He caught fragments. Table 70. Table 340. Table 9. Everything was out of order, arranged in some incomprehensible pattern that probably made perfect sense to the Valorians, but looked like pure chaos to human eyes. Then he saw it. A table with what looked like 17 hovering above it. The holographic script was flickering slightly, his translator working overtime to render it clearly, but the shape was right. The double digit, the curve of the 7. This had to be it. The table was surprisingly close to the center of the hall, far more prominent than Ethan had expected for someone of his status, but maybe they'd made a mistake with the seating chart. Or maybe humans were more important than he thought. Unlikely, given how most of the galaxy treated Earth, but stranger things had happened. The table was empty except for one occupant. She sat in what looked like an advanced mobility chair, though chair seemed an inadequate word for the elegant contraption. It was more like a throne made of flowing silver metal that seemed to move and adjust itself constantly, responding to minute shifts in her posture. The girl looked young, maybe early 20s in human terms, with the characteristic crystalline skin of the Valorians. But where other Valorians gleamed with vibrant inner light, hers was muted, pale, like crystal that had been frosted over. Her features were delicate, almost fragile, with large violet eyes that tracked him as he approached. She wore a gown of deep purple that seemed to shift and flow like liquid, obviously expensive, obviously custom-made. Her hair, if it could be called hair, was more like fine strands of translucent crystal that cascaded over her shoulders, each strand catching and refracting the ambient light. But despite all the obvious markers of wealth and status, there was something melancholic about her, a loneliness that Ethan recognized instinctively. He'd seen that same expression on his own face often enough in the mirror, back when he'd first arrived on Valoria with nothing but a toolbox and a head full of mechanical knowledge that nobody wanted. Well, if this was Table 17, at least his dinner companion seemed quiet. Maybe they could both sit in uncomfortable silence for a few hours, eat whatever incomprehensible alien delicacy they served, and then he could escape back to his workshop where things made sense. Ethan pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, trying not to wince as his suit jacket pulled tight across his shoulders. The girl's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't say anything. Her hands, resting on the arms of her chair, seemed to tense. Ethan offered what he hoped was a friendly smile. "So," he said, his translator fumbling with Valerian pronunciation. "Quite the party, huh?" The girl stared at him for a long moment, her violet eyes scanning him from head to toe. Then, in perfectly accented English that his translator barely had to touch, she spoke. "You are human." It wasn't a question, but Ethan nodded anyway. "Guilty as charged." "Ethan Cole. I fix machines for a living." He extended his hand across the table, then remembered that Valorians didn't really do handshakes. He withdrew it awkwardly and tried to cover the gesture by adjusting his napkin. "Sorry. Human habit. I know what a handshake is," the girl said softly. She made no move to reciprocate, but her expression had shifted from shock to something else. Curiosity, maybe. Or amusement. "You are at the wrong table." Ethan felt his stomach drop. Of course he was. Of course. He pulled out his invitation, a small holographic chip that projected his assignment when activated. "Table 17, see?" He held it up, showing her the flickering script. The girl leaned forward slightly, her chair adjusting smoothly to accommodate the movement. "That says Table 717, she said gently. "Your translator is malfunctioning. The prefix symbol is damaged in your display." Ethan looked at the hologram again, and now that she mentioned it, he could see the corruption in the script. What he'd thought was a simple 17 was actually much more complex, with additional characters his translator had simply ignored. 717. Not 17. Of course. He was an idiot. He started, beginning to stand. "I should go find my actual table. Sorry to bother you." "Wait," the girl said, and something in her voice made Ethan pause. "Please, do not leave on my account." Ethan hesitated, half standing, caught between politeness and the growing certainty that he'd stumbled into something well above his pay grade. This table was too nice, too close to the center of the hall. This girl, despite her muted coloring and obvious disability, wore clothing that probably cost more than his workshop would earn in a year. Every instinct told him to run. But she was looking at him with those violet eyes, and there was something in her expression that reminded him of himself when he'd first arrived on Valoria. That desperate hope for connection, the ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Then you are perhaps the most qualified person to be sitting here," she said. "Everyone else will spend the evening discussing politics and trade agreements and which houses are forming advantageous alliances. I would much rather hear about swearing at machines." Ethan couldn't help but grin. "Well, if you insist. Though I gotta warn you, most of my stories end with something exploding or nearly electrocuting me. Then they will be infinitely more interesting than anything else I will hear tonight," the girl said. Her chair shifted again, bringing her slightly closer to the table. "My name is Sarah. It is a pleasure to meet you. Ethan Cole, who fixes machines." "The pleasure is mine, Sarah," Ethan replied, and found that he meant it. The next hour passed faster than Ethan would have thought possible. Sarah, despite her obvious privilege and status, was surprisingly easy to talk to. She asked questions about his work, genuine questions that showed real curiosity about the technical details. When he described the time he'd had to repair a freight hauler's engine while it was still running because the captain couldn't afford to dock, She actually laughed, a sound like wind chimes that made several nearby Valorians turn and stare. Ethan found himself relaxing, his earlier nervousness fading as they talked. He told her about Earth, about growing up in a small town in Colorado, about deciding to leave his home planet because he wanted to see the stars up close. She listened intently, asking occasional questions, her violet eyes never leaving his face. In turn, she told him about Valoria, about growing up in the palace, though she was vague about her exact position in the hierarchy. She described the gardens, vast and intricate, filled with plants that sang in harmonic frequencies. She talked about her tutors, about learning 17 languages before she was 10, about studying the history of every species in the known galaxy. But there was a wistfulness in her voice when she spoke, a sense of something missing. "You have never left the palace, have you?" Ethan asked gently. Sarah's expression flickered, something painful crossing her features. "No," she said quietly. "I have not. My condition makes travel difficult. Dangerous, even." She gestured to her chair, to her legs which rested motionless beneath the flowing fabric of her gown. "I have been paralyzed since birth. A genetic defect, rare among Valorians. The healers can do nothing for it." Ethan felt a pang of sympathy. "I am sorry," he said. "That must be hard." Sarah shrugged, a graceful movement despite her paralysis. "It is all I have ever known. I do not mourn what I never had. But sometimes I wonder what it would be like to walk through those gardens I study, to feel the plants' vibrations through my feet instead of just hearing descriptions." Before Ethan could respond, a ripple of activity swept through the hall. The ambient conversation dropped to a murmur, then to silence. Every Valerian in the room turned toward the main entrance, their crystalline faces reflecting sudden alertness. Even the representatives from other species straightened, their attention drawn to whatever was happening. Ethan twisted in his seat to see what had caused the disturbance. A figure was entering the hall, flanked by guards in ornate armor that gleamed with embedded circuitry. The figure himself was tall, even for a Valerian, his crystalline skin shimmering with such intense inner light that it was almost hard to look at directly. He wore robes of deep crimson and gold, layered and complex, each fold seeming to contain its own intricate patterns. His face was austere, commanding, with sharp angular features and eyes that glowed with an inner fire. This was someone important. Very important. "Who is that?" Ethan whispered to Sarah. Her face had gone completely still, all expression carefully schooled away. "That is my father," she said quietly. "Emperor Valendris, ruler of the Valerian Empire." The bottom dropped out of Ethan's stomach. "Emperor." She'd said emperor, which meant she was. "Oh no. Oh no, no, no. You are the princess," Ethan said, his voice strangled. "You are the princess and I sat at your table, and I have been talking about exploding engines and swearing at hyperdrives for an hour." Sarah's lips quirked in something that might have been amusement. "Technically, Imperial Daughter is the proper title," she said. "But yes, I thought you realized." "How would I realize?" Ethan hissed, acutely aware that Emperor Valendris was moving through the hall, stopping at tables to exchange brief words with important-looking dignitaries. Each stop brought him closer to their position. "I thought you were just someone's daughter." "Someone important, sure, but not the literal princess of the entire empire." "Does it matter?" Sarah asked, and there was a challenge in her voice now. "Does my title change who I am? Does it make our conversation less real?" "No, but it makes me sitting here way more inappropriate," Ethan shot back. "Your dad is probably going to have me executed for disrespecting you or something." Sarah's expression softened. "You have not disrespected me, Ethan Cole. You have treated me like a person, which is more than most people in this room have done in years." She glanced toward her father, who was now only a few tables away. "And my father will not have you executed." Probably. Probably. He has a sense of humor," Sarah said. "Sometimes." Emperor Valendris reached their table before Ethan could formulate a response. Up close, the Emperor was even more imposing, his presence filling the space like a physical force. His eyes, burning with that inner light, swept over Ethan with the kind of assessment that could probably calculate the exact value of a person's entire existence in half a second. Those eyes moved to Sarah, and something in the Emperor's expression shifted. Not softening, exactly, but changing in some subtle way. "Daughter," the Emperor said, his voice resonating with harmonics that Ethan's translator struggled to render. "I see you have found a companion for the evening." "Yes, Father," Sarah replied, her tone formal now, stripped of the warmth she'd shown Ethan. "This is Ethan Cole. He is a mechanic from Earth. We have been discussing the principles of hyperdrive repair." The Emperor's glowing eyes returned to Ethan, who had the distinct impression he was being evaluated like a particularly interesting piece of machinery. "A mechanic," Emperor Valendris repeated. "And how did a mechanic come to be seated at table 17? Ethan cleared his throat, fighting the urge to stand and bow and generally make an even bigger fool of himself. "Translator malfunction, Your Majesty," he managed. "I thought my assignment said 17 when it actually said 717. I sat down before I realized my mistake. The princess, your daughter, Imperial daughter Sarah was kind enough not to immediately call security." A long pause. The Emperor's expression was unreadable, that crystalline face revealing nothing. Ethan could feel sweat beginning to form at his collar, despite the perfectly controlled temperature of the hall. This was it. This was how he died, executed for the crime of accidentally sitting at the wrong table. Then Emperor Valendris did something Ethan did not expect. He laughed. It was a short sound, barely more than an exhale, but it was definitely a laugh. "His daughter has always had an unfortunate habit of collecting strays," the Emperor said, though his tone held more affection than criticism. "Very well, Ethan Cole of Earth. You may remain at this table for the duration of the evening, since my daughter seems to enjoy your company. But I expect you to be on your best behavior." "Of course, Your Majesty," Ethan said, relief flooding through him. "I promise no exploding engines or inappropriate swearing." The Emperor's lips twitched, almost imperceptibly. "See that you do not." He turned to Sarah, and his expression did soften then, just slightly. "I am glad to see you smiling, daughter. It has been too long." "Thank you, Father," Sarah said quietly. The Emperor moved on, continuing his circuit of the hall, his guards following at a respectful distance. Ethan slumped in his chair, feeling like he'd just survived a near-death experience. "That could have gone worse," he muttered. "Much worse," Sarah agreed. "Father can be quite intimidating when he wishes to be." She tilted her head, studying him. "You handled that well. Most people cannot form coherent sentences in his presence." "I was barely forming coherent sentences," Ethan protested. "I think I called you Imperial Daughter, Your Majesty, or something equally stupid." "You called me Imperial Daughter, Sarah, which is technically correct," Sarah said. "I have heard far worse attempts at protocol." She paused, her expression turning serious. "Thank you, Ethan, for not running away when you learned who I was. For staying, even though my father could have reacted poorly." "I gave you my word I would stay," Ethan said with a shrug. "Where I come from, that means something. Besides, you are literally the first person on this planet who has treated me like something other than a walking embarrassment to the concept of sentience. The least I can do is sit through dinner with you." Sarah's smile returned, warmer now. "Then let us continue our conversation. You were telling me about the freight hauler captain who tried to pay you in live cargo." Ethan grinned. "Oh, that story gets so much worse." The dinner itself was an elaborate affair, course after course of foods that Ethan couldn't begin to identify. Some of it was delicious, some of it tasted like sweetened plastic, and one dish seemed to actively try to crawl off his plate until Sarah helpfully explained that yes, it was still alive. That was considered a delicacy among certain Valerian houses. Ethan politely declined that particular course and watched in horrified fascination as Sarah consumed it with practiced ease. Between courses, they talked. Sarah asked about Earth cities, about human culture, about the concept of family structures among his people. Ethan did his best to answer, though he had to admit his knowledge was limited to his own experiences. He'd left Earth young, driven by wanderlust and a desperate need to escape the suffocating familiarity of his hometown. He described the mountains of Colorado, the way snow would blanket everything in winter, the summer storms that rolled across the plains with thunder that shook the ground. In turn, Sarah described Valoria's capital city, the way the buildings grew rather than being constructed, shaped by specialized biotechnology into organic forms that pulsed with their own light. She talked about the singing gardens, where plants had been engineered to respond to sound and movement, creating living symphonies. She described the night of crystals, an annual festival where the entire city would dim its lights and let the natural bioluminescence of Valoria's flora illuminate the streets in shifting colors. She spoke of all these things with knowledge, but without experience, and Ethan realized that she'd never actually seen them herself. She'd studied them, learned about them, absorbed every detail from tutors and recordings, but she'd never walked through those streets or stood in those gardens. Her paralysis and whatever other health complications came with it had made her a prisoner in her own palace, able to learn about the world but never touch it. "That is not fair," Ethan said at one point, his usual filter failing him. "You should be able to see all of that yourself. You should be able to walk through those gardens and touch those plants and experience the festival in person." Sarah's expression flickered with something painful. "Life is rarely fair, Ethan. I learned that lesson early." She glanced down at her motionless legs. "The healers have tried everything. Genetic therapy, neural reconstruction, stem cell regeneration, even experimental technology from the Lemnians. Nothing works. The defect is too fundamental, too woven into my basic structure. To fix it would require essentially rewriting my entire genetic code, and even then, success is not guaranteed." "What about mechanical assistance?" Ethan asked. "I mean, not to presume that I know better than your fancy healers or whatever, but surely there are prosthetics or exoskeletons or something that could help." Sarah shook her head. "We have tried those as well. My body rejects them. The crystalline structure of Valerian physiology does not integrate well with most mechanical systems. The neural interfaces fail, the connections degrade. I have tried 7 different mobility devices over the years. None lasted more than a few months before my body began treating them as foreign objects." "What about this chair?" Ethan gestured to the elegant throne-like device she sat in. "This is a passive system," Sarah explained. "It responds to my movements, supports my weight, but it does not actually interface with my nervous system. It is more like very sophisticated furniture than true assistive technology." She ran her hand along the chair's arm, and the metal seemed to ripple under her touch. "It serves its purpose, but it is not the same as walking." Ethan found himself studying the chair with professional interest, his mechanic's brain automatically analyzing its construction. The metal was some kind of smart alloy, obviously capable of responding to stimuli and adjusting its shape dynamically. The power source had to be incredibly efficient to run something that sophisticated without visible battery packs. The control systems must be incredibly subtle, reading minute cues from Sarah's body position and perhaps even her bioelectric field. An idea began forming in the back of his mind, crazy and probably impossible, but the kind of idea that always got him into trouble. "What if," he started, then stopped. "Never mind. It is a stupid thought." "Tell me," Sarah said, leaning forward with interest. "I enjoy stupid thoughts. They are often more interesting than smart ones." Ethan hesitated, then figured he'd already made a fool of himself enough times tonight that one more wouldn't matter. "What if you do not need to interface with your nervous system? What if instead you built a system that reads your intention through other means? Bioelectric patterns, muscle tension, even brain activity if you can get non-invasive scanners sensitive enough. Then translate those readings into movement through a completely separate mechanical system. No direct neural interface required." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her violet eyes studying him intently. "That," she said slowly, "is not a stupid thought at all. That is actually quite brilliant. Why has no one suggested this before?" Ethan shrugged. "Because I am an idiot mechanic who fixes broken engines, and your healers are probably way too specialized in biology to think about pure mechanical solutions? I mean, I could be completely wrong. Your body might reject that kind of system too. Or it might not," Sarah said, and there was something new in her voice now. Hope, carefully controlled but unmistakable. "The chair already reads some of my bioelectric patterns. If that technology could be expanded, made more sophisticated, integrated into a full mobility system." She trailed off, lost in thought. "It would be complicated," Ethan warned. "You would essentially need to build a completely separate nervous system running parallel to your biological one. Sensors covering your entire body, sophisticated enough to read intention without invasive connections. And then the mechanical structure to translate those intentions into movement. It would be like, I don't know, building a second skeleton on the outside of your body. Like powered armor, Sarah said. I have read about such things. Some species use them for combat or for working in hazardous environments. Exactly like powered armor, Ethan agreed, but way more sophisticated. Combat armor just needs to respond to gross motor commands. Walk, run, shoot. What you would need would have to be sensitive enough to handle fine motor control. Picking up a cup, turning pages, dancing if you wanted to. Dancing, Sarah repeated softly, and the longing in her voice was almost painful to hear. I have watched recordings of dancing. It looks like music made visible. It kind of is, Ethan said. My sister dragged me to dance lessons before her wedding. I was terrible at it, but she loved it. Said it made her feel like she was flying. I would very much like to know what flying feels like, Sarah said. Before Ethan could respond, a sudden commotion rippled through the hall. The elegant atmosphere shattered as several Valerian guards rushed toward one of the far tables. Shouting erupted, harsh and discordant against the previous calm. Ethan twisted in his seat, trying to see what was happening. An alien, one of the insectoid chitters, was standing on a table, its multiple limbs gesticulating wildly. Its chittering was so rapid and intense that Ethan's translator could barely keep up, catching only fragments. Disrespect, poison, conspiracy, treachery. The creature's compound eyes were reflecting light in a pattern that Ethan's limited knowledge of chitter culture told him indicated extreme agitation. Several guards had formed a perimeter around the table, their weapons drawn but not aimed. They seemed unsure how to handle the situation. The chitter was important enough to be at this dinner, which meant it had diplomatic status, which meant using force could trigger an incident. But the creature was clearly becoming more agitated by the second, its chittering rising in pitch and speed. Emperor Valendris was moving toward the disturbance, his expression cold and controlled. Other dignitaries were backing away, creating a widening circle of empty space around the scene. Ethan noticed that Sarah had gone very still, her hands gripping the arms of her chair tightly. What is happening? Ethan whispered. Ambassador Churex of the Hive Worlds, Sarah murmured. He has been unstable for some time. There are rumors that he believes the Valerian Empire is plotting against his people. She watched her father approach the agitated chitter. This could become very bad very quickly. Emperor Valendris reached the perimeter of guards and gestured for them to lower their weapons. He began speaking to the chitter in its own language, a series of clicks and whistles that Ethan's translator rendered as calm reassurances. The Emperor was good at this, his voice steady, his posture non-threatening despite his obvious power. He was trying to de-escalate, to bring the ambassador down from whatever paranoid spiral had gripped him. For a moment, it seemed to be working. The chitter's chittering slowed, its limbs settling slightly. But then one of the guards shifted position, a slight movement, probably unconscious, and the chitter's compound eyes locked onto the motion. In an instant, the creature's agitation spiked again, its chittering becoming almost a scream. Then everything happened very fast. The chitter lunged, not at the Emperor, but at one of the guards. Its limbs moved in a blur, faster than Ethan would have thought possible, going for the guard's weapon. The guard, trained and quick, pulled back, but not before the chitter's claws scraped across his arm. The weapon discharged, a bolt of energy that went wild, lancing across the hall. The bolt struck one of the floating luminaries, which exploded in a shower of sparks and glass. Pieces of the shattered light fixture rained down across multiple tables. Aliens shouted and dove for cover. More guards rushed forward, trying to restrain the now fully berserk chitter. The Emperor was shouting orders, his voice cutting through the chaos with command authority. Ethan saw it before anyone else did. A large piece of the broken luminary, easily the size of his head, was falling in a trajectory that would bring it right down toward. He did not think. He just moved. His chair crashed backward as he lunged across the table, his hands finding Sarah's chair and shoving with all his strength. The sophisticated device, not designed for sudden violent movement, resisted for a split second before its safety protocols kicked in and allowed the motion. Sarah's chair slid 3 feet to the left just as the chunk of crystalline material slammed into the space where she'd been sitting. It hit the ground with enough force to crack the polished floor, sending smaller fragments scattering in every direction. If Sarah had still been there, it would have struck her directly in the head. Ethan found himself sprawled half across the table, breathing hard, his heart hammering. Sarah was staring at him with wide violet eyes, shock written clearly across her crystalline features. Around them, the chaos was beginning to subside. Guards had finally restrained Ambassador Churex, who was still chittering but with less violence. Emperor Valendris had restored some semblance of order, his voice commanding silence and calm. "You," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "You saved my life." Ethan pushed himself up, wincing as he realized he'd landed on something sharp. His hand was bleeding, a long shallow cut across his palm. "Just reflex," he muttered. "Saw it falling, moved without thinking." "That piece would have killed me," Sarah said, looking at the shattered crystal on the floor. "Without question. And you did not hesitate." She looked back at him, something profound in her expression. "You barely know me, and you did not hesitate." "Like I said," Ethan replied, wrapping his bleeding hand in a napkin. "Where I come from, that is just what you do. You see someone in danger, you help. It is not complicated." Before Sarah could respond, Emperor Valendris was there, his guards forming a protective circle. His burning eyes swept over Sarah first, checking for injury with the swift efficiency of a parent who had clearly done this many times before. Then those eyes fixed on Ethan, and the intensity of that gaze nearly made him step back. "You are injured," the Emperor said, noting Ethan's bleeding hand. "It is nothing, Your Majesty," Ethan said quickly. "Just a cut. I will be fine." "You pushed my daughter out of harm's way," Emperor Valendris continued. "You saw danger and acted without hesitation or thought for your own safety." He paused, and something shifted in his expression. "I am in your debt, Ethan Coloverth." "Really, it was nothing," Ethan protested, deeply uncomfortable with the level of attention suddenly focused on him. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Sarah said quietly. "They would not have. Most people in this room would have frozen. Or worse, they would have calculated the political ramifications before acting." She looked at her father. He did not think. He simply moved. Emperor Valendris nodded slowly. "Then he is either very brave or very foolish." He studied Ethan for another long moment. "I suspect it is both." He gestured to one of his guards. "See that his hand is treated properly, and arrange for him to be escorted safely home when the evening concludes. I will not have my daughter's savior come to harm under my roof." The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Healers tended to Ethan's hand with technology that sealed the wound in seconds, leaving not even a scar. Ambassador Churex was quietly removed from the hall, to be dealt with through diplomatic channels. The shattered luminary was cleared away, the damaged floor sealed with some kind of instant repair compound. Within 20 minutes, it was as if nothing had happened, though Ethan noticed people were giving their table a wide berth now. Sarah insisted he stay until the dinner formally concluded. They talked more, though the earlier ease was complicated now by what had happened. Ethan found himself acutely aware of how close he'd come to watching someone die. Someone he'd been talking and laughing with just moments before. The thought made him feel slightly sick. When the evening finally ended and guests began filtering out, Sarah's chair moved closer to Ethan's side. "I would like to see you again," she said without preamble. "If you are willing." Ethan blinked, surprised. "You want to see me? The grease monkey mechanic who sat at the wrong table? I want to see the man who treated me like a person and then saved my life without hesitation," Sarah corrected. "I want to hear more of your stories about exploding engines and impossible repairs. And," she added, her voice turning thoughtful, "I want to discuss your idea about the mobility system. In detail." "You were serious about that?" Ethan asked. "I mean, I was just spitballing. I have no idea if it would actually work." "Neither do I," Sarah said. "But I would like to find out. Will you come to the palace tomorrow? We can talk properly, away from formal dinners and falling debris." Ethan considered. Every rational part of his brain told him this was a terrible idea. She was the imperial daughter. He was a mechanic who could barely afford rent. They existed in completely different worlds. But then he remembered the hope in her voice when he described the possibility of her walking, the loneliness in her eyes when she talked about gardens she'd never visited. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I will come." "What time?" Sarah smiled, and it transformed her face, made her look younger and more alive. "Morning. The second hour after sunrise. I will send a transport for you." She paused. "Thank you, Ethan. For everything." "You already thanked me," Ethan pointed out. "I know," Sarah said, "but I do not think I can thank you enough." The transport arrived at Ethan's workshop exactly at the second hour after sunrise, which given the state of his shop was probably 2 hours earlier than anyone should reasonably be awake. Ethan had been up for 3 hours already, too wired from the previous evening to sleep. He'd spent most of the night sketching diagrams, his mind spinning with possibilities and problems, and the sheer audacity of what he'd suggested. The transport was, predictably, way too nice for his neighborhood. It was a sleek silver vehicle that hovered silently, its surface seamlessly smooth without visible seams or joints. When it landed in front of his shop, several of his neighbors came out to stare. Ethan waved awkwardly at them, grabbed his tool bag out of habit, and climbed into the transport before anyone could ask questions he had no idea how to answer. The interior was even more luxurious than the exterior, all soft materials and adaptive surfaces that somehow knew exactly how to support his weight. A Valerian driver sat at the front, separated by a privacy screen that was currently transparent. The driver nodded politely to Ethan but did not speak, simply input commands into the control system and lifted off. The flight to the palace took about 30 minutes, carrying them from the industrial district where Ethan's workshop was located up through progressively wealthier neighborhoods until they reached the palace district. The palace itself was impossible to miss, a massive structure that seemed to grow directly out of the living rock of Valoria's largest mountain. Its walls pulsed with bioluminescent patterns, organic architecture on a scale that made Ethan's engineer brain hurt trying to comprehend the structural requirements. They landed on a private platform about halfway up the palace's eastern face. Sarah was waiting there, her chair positioned near the edge where she could look out over the city spreading below. She turned when Ethan approached, and he was struck again by how different she looked in natural light. Her crystalline skin, so pale and muted in the artificial illumination of the dining hall, now caught the morning sun and refracted it in subtle rainbows. "Good morning," she said. "Did you sleep?" "Not really," Ethan admitted. "Spent most of the night thinking about mechanical problems and probably impossible engineering challenges." Sarah's smile was understanding. "I did much the same, though my thoughts focused more on biological limitations and integration issues." She gestured to a seating area that had been set up on the platform, comfortable chairs arranged around a table that held what looked like breakfast. "Come, eat. We have much to discuss." Over breakfast, which consisted of foods Ethan mostly recognized and could actually identify, they talked. Sarah had clearly spent her sleepless night doing research. She pulled up holographic displays showing the limitations of existing mobility technology, the specifications of various exoskeleton systems used by other species, the detailed medical reports on her own condition. Ethan listened and asked questions, his mind churning through the information. The core problem was compatibility. Valerian crystalline physiology was fundamentally different from the carbon-based biology of most other species. Their nervous systems operated on different principles, their cellular structure responded poorly to foreign materials, their bodies generated a low-level bioelectric field that interfered with most electronic systems. But, Ethan said, thinking out loud, what if we do not treat it as a medical device at all? What if we treat it as armor? Something completely separate from your body that just happens to respond to your intentions. That is still a neural interface problem, Sarah pointed out. How do you read intention without interfacing? You are already interfacing with your chair, Ethan said. And that works fine. So whatever technology makes that possible, we just need to expand it. Make it more sensitive, more comprehensive. Sarah pulled up specifications for her chair. The system reads surface bioelectric patterns and muscle tension, she explained. It is very basic, only capable of detecting large-scale movements and weight shifts. Nothing close to what you are proposing. Right, but it is a starting point, Ethan argued. We know that level of interface works with your biology, so we scale it up. Hundreds of sensors instead of dozens. More sophisticated analysis algorithms. We map every bioelectric pattern your body generates when you think about moving. I cannot actually move, Sarah reminded him gently. I cannot generate normal movement patterns. No, but you can think about moving, Ethan said. Your brain still sends the signals, right? They just do not reach your muscles properly. But the signals exist. We just need to intercept them before they get lost in your damaged neural pathways. Sarah was quiet for a moment, her violet eyes distant with thought. You are proposing to essentially build a system that can read my mind, she said slowly. Not your mind, Ethan corrected. Just your motor intentions. And only if we can figure out how to do it without invasive implants. He pulled out his own small datapad, which looked pathetically primitive compared to Sarah's holographic displays. Let me show you something. He sketched quickly, his stylus flying across the screen as he roughed out a concept. A bodysuit, skin-tight, covered in microscopic sensors. Over that, a mechanical exoskeleton, lightweight but strong, powered by compact energy cells. The sensors read bioelectric signals and muscle movements, no matter how small. The data goes to a processing unit that translates those signals into commands for the exoskeleton. You think about moving your hand. The sensors detect the pattern, the processors interpret it, the exoskeleton moves. And if my body rejects the sensors? Sarah asked. We make them biocompatible, Ethan said. I do not know enough about Valerian physiology to say exactly how, but there has to be a way. Some material that your body will tolerate. Hell, maybe we grow them from your own cells or something. That, Sarah said, studying his crude sketch, is biosynthetic integration. Growing technology from biological templates. It has been attempted before, but never successfully with Valerian tissue. Which means it is hard, not impossible, Ethan countered. Look, I am not saying this will definitely work. I am saying it might work, which is better than definitely will not work. And if it fails, we learn something and try again. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. You really believe we could do this? She said. It was not quite a question. I believe we can try, Ethan said. And I am pretty good at making impossible things work through sheer stubbornness. Sarah's expression softened into something warm. Then let us begin. She reached out and tapped commands into her holographic interface. I am giving you full access to the palace research facilities and medical archives. Whatever you need, wherever you need it, consider it yours. Whoa, hold on, Ethan said. I am not qualified to, I am just a mechanic. Should we not get actual scientists involved? We will, Sarah assured him. But this is your idea, Ethan. Your vision. You should lead the effort. Led? Ethan felt panic rising. I do not know how to lead anything. I work alone in a shop fixing other people's broken stuff. Then you will learn, Sarah said simply. As will I. This will be a collaboration. Your mechanical expertise and my medical knowledge combined. She smiled. Besides, you are the only person I trust to actually see this through. A scientist might give up when it becomes difficult. You strike me as someone who does not know how to give up. She was not wrong about that. Ethan had built his entire career on being too stubborn to admit when something was impossible. Why stop now? All right, he said. All right, let us do this. But I am going to need a lot of help. And probably access to tools and materials I cannot even pronounce. Sarah's smile widened. I believe that can be arranged. The next 3 months were the most intense of Ethan's life. Sarah had not been kidding about giving him access to resources. Within a week, Ethan found himself working in a laboratory that was probably worth more than his entire home planet, surrounded by equipment that made his workshop tools look like stone knives. Sarah had also recruited a team of experts, medical specialists and materials engineers and robotics designers, all of them initially skeptical about working under the direction of a human mechanic, but willing to try because the imperial daughter had asked. The first month was spent on pure research. They needed to understand exactly how Sarah's biology worked, map every aspect of her bioelectric patterns, identify materials that her body would not reject. Ethan spent hours every day with her, attaching experimental sensors, measuring responses, building an ever more detailed picture of how her body functioned. It was during this phase that Ethan really got to know Sarah as more than just the lonely princess he'd met at a dinner. She was brilliant, her mind sharp and quick, capable of understanding complex technical concepts after a single explanation. She was also stubborn, refusing to give up even when experiments failed, sometimes spending 16 hours straight in the lab despite her attendance protests. And she was funny, her dry wit catching Ethan off guard regularly, making him laugh even when he was exhausted and frustrated. They also talked about other things, during breaks and late evenings when the rest of the team had gone home. Sarah told him about her childhood, about growing up knowing she was different, knowing she would never be the kind of ruler her father was because she could not even stand before her people. She talked about the loneliness of always being surrounded by attendants and guards, but never having real friends, people who saw her as Sarah rather than as Imperial daughter. Ethan, in turn, told her about Earth, about his family, about the desperate loneliness he'd felt when he first arrived on Valoria. He described the grinding poverty of trying to establish himself, the discrimination he'd faced as a human in a galaxy that generally saw Earth as a backwater, the small victories that had kept him going. They bonded over shared isolation, two people who had spent most of their lives feeling fundamentally disconnected from everyone around them. The second month brought the first real breakthrough. One of the materials engineers, a Laminian named Kareth, figured out how to create a sensor substrate that Sarah's body would accept. It involved growing the sensors using a sample of her own cells as a template, essentially creating biological technology that her immune system recognized as self. It was delicate, expensive, and time-consuming, but it worked. The first time they successfully mapped Sarah's full-body bioelectric patterns, Ethan actually shouted in triumph, startling the entire lab. Sarah had laughed at his enthusiasm, but he could see the hope in her eyes, carefully guarded but definitely there. With working sensors, they could move to the next phase, building the actual exoskeleton. This was where Ethan's expertise really came into play. He designed the mechanical structure, a framework of lightweight alloys and smart materials that could provide support and movement without being too bulky or heavy. The engineering challenges were immense. The system had to be strong enough to support Sarah's full weight, responsive enough to handle fine motor control, and efficient enough to run for hours on portable power cells. Ethan worked like a man possessed, often forgetting to eat or sleep until Sarah or one of the team members forced him to take breaks. He redesigned components a dozen times, tested materials until he could recite their specifications in his sleep, wrote control algorithms that made his eyes blur from staring at code for too long. But slowly, impossibly, it started to come together. Individual components became subsystems. Subsystems integrated into a whole. By the end of the second month, they had something that looked vaguely like what Ethan had sketched on that first morning, a sleek bodysuit covered in biosynthetic sensors, overlaid with an elegant exoskeleton that resembled crystalline armor more than machinery. The third month was testing, endless iterations of calibration and adjustment. They started with basic responses, teaching the system to recognize when Sarah thought about moving her fingers. It took 2 weeks to get that working reliably. Then the toes, the feet, the legs. Each new part of her body required its own calibration profile, its own set of algorithms to translate intention into movement. There were setbacks. The system locked up during an early test, freezing Sarah in an uncomfortable position for 10 minutes while they frantically worked to reset it. One of the hip actuators failed catastrophically during another test, nearly causing her to fall before the safety protocols engaged. Ethan nearly gave up a dozen times, convinced they were chasing an impossible dream. But Sarah never wavered. Even when experiments failed, even when her body ached from being strapped into the prototype for hours, even when the whole thing seemed hopeless, she insisted they continue. And slowly, incrementally, it started to work. The day of the first full test arrived with little fanfare. They had not told anyone outside the core team, not wanting to risk disappointment if it failed. It was just Ethan, Sarah, Kareth, and 2 medical specialists in a testing chamber deep in the Palace Research Wing. Sarah was suited up in the full system for the 20th time, the biosynthetic sensors conforming to her body, the exoskeleton locked around her limbs. She looked like a warrior from some ancient story, all elegant lines and crystalline surfaces. The control unit, a small processor attached to her back, hummed quietly as it ran through diagnostic checks. All systems nominal, Kareth reported, monitoring readouts on a holographic display. Bioelectric sensors reading clear. Actuators responding. Power at 97%. Sarah looked at Ethan, and he could see the fear in her eyes, carefully hidden but present. What if this does not work? She asked quietly. Then we try again, Ethan said. But Sarah? I think it is going to work. He activated the final sequence, the one that would bring the full system online and give Sarah complete control. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Sarah's eyes widened, and one of her hands twitched, a tiny movement, but definitely intentional. She was staring at her hand like she'd never seen it before. I felt that, she whispered. I thought about moving, and I felt the intention being received. Try something bigger, Ethan encouraged. Take your time. Sarah's face was a mask of concentration. Her right foot lifted off the ground, just an inch, held for a moment, then lowered. The movement was shaky, imprecise, but it was there. It was real. Oh, Sarah breathed. Oh, this is. She tried the other foot, then her left hand. Each movement was slow, deliberate, clearly requiring immense focus. But they were movements. After 23 years of paralysis, she was moving her limbs through conscious thought. Tears were streaming down her crystalline face, refracting in the lab lights. Ethan realized he was crying too, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they had just achieved. Do you think, Sarah started, her voice shaking. Do you think I could stand? Let us find out, Ethan said. It took 10 minutes of careful adjustment, the exoskeleton's support systems gradually taking more of her weight. Sarah's legs, which had never supported her body before, trembled with the effort even with mechanical assistance. But inch by inch, she rose from her chair. The exoskeleton hummed, micro-adjustments happening hundreds of times per second to maintain balance. And then, impossibly, Sarah was standing, her own 2 feet on the ground, looking down at herself from a height she had never experienced. I am tall, she said, and laughed through her tears. I never knew I was this tall. Ethan could not speak, too choked up to form words. Kareth was openly crying, their ethereal Laminian features shimmering with emotion. The medical specialists were frantically taking readings, documenting every aspect of this moment. Sarah took a step, just one, slow and careful, her concentration absolute. The exoskeleton responded perfectly, translating her intention into smooth mechanical motion. Her foot lifted, moved forward, came down. She swayed slightly, balance precarious, but the system caught her, stabilized her. Then she took another step, and another, each one more confident than the last as she began to understand how to work with the system, how to think about movement in a way that the sensors could interpret. After 10 steps, she stopped, breathing hard from the mental effort. She looked at Ethan, and the joy on her face was so intense it was almost painful to witness. I am walking, she said. Ethan, I am walking. You are walking, he confirmed, his voice rough with emotion. Sarah looked around the lab, at all the equipment and materials that had gone into this moment. Then her eyes fixed on a door at the far end of the chamber. That leads to the singing gardens, she said. I have studied them all my life. I have never been inside them. She looked at Ethan. Will you walk with me? I would be honored, Ethan said. The singing gardens were even more beautiful than Sarah had described. They stepped through the door, and Ethan found himself in a space that seemed to exist outside normal reality. Plants of every imaginable variety grew in careful arrangements, their leaves and flowers engineered to respond to sound and movement with gentle harmonies. As Sarah took her first steps into the garden, the plants nearest her began to hum, a soft, welcoming sound that rippled outward through the space. Sarah stopped, overwhelmed. The plants are singing to me, she whispered. I never imagined it would be like this. They walked slowly through the gardens, Sarah testing her limits, learning how to navigate uneven ground and steps. The exoskeleton handled it all gracefully, its advanced balance systems compensating for her inexperience. Plants sang as they passed, creating a moving symphony that followed them through the winding paths. Sarah reached out to touch a flower, something she had never been able to do properly from her chair. The plant responded to her touch with a melodic chime, and she laughed with delight. This is everything I dreamed it would be, she said. Thank you, Ethan. Thank you for giving me this. You did most of the work, Ethan protested. I just had the initial idea. Sarah shook her head. You believed it was possible when no one else did. You refused to give up when I was ready to. This was only possible because you cared enough to try. She paused in a small clearing where crystalline flowers grew in spiraling patterns. I do not know how I will ever repay you. You already have, Ethan said. You gave me a reason to use my skills for something that actually matters. You reminded me why I became a mechanic in the first place, to help people, to solve impossible problems. And you, he hesitated, then continued. You became my friend. That is worth more than any payment. Sarah turned to face him fully, a movement that was still careful but growing more natural. I would like to be more than friends, she said quietly. If you would want that. Ethan's heart, which had been through so much in the past few months, somehow found the capacity to beat even faster. Sarah, I am a mechanic. You are literally a princess. Imperial daughter. Whatever. The point is, we are from completely different worlds. We are from the same world, Sarah corrected. Valoria, where a mechanic and a princess work together to achieve the impossible. She stepped closer, and the plants around them seemed to hum with encouragement. I know there will be complications. My father may not approve. The court will certainly have opinions. But I have spent my entire life living according to other people's expectations and limitations. For once, I would like to choose something for myself. She reached out and took his hand. I choose you, Ethan Cole, if you will have me. Ethan looked down at their joined hands, his work-scarred fingers intertwined with her crystalline ones. The exoskeleton was working perfectly, allowing her to maintain the gentle pressure to feel the connection. Every rational part of his brain was screaming that this was a terrible idea, that it could only end in heartbreak and complications he was in no way prepared to handle. But when he looked up at her face, at the hope and determination in her violet eyes, rationality did not seem very important. Yeah, he said. Yeah, I will have you. But I need you to know I have no idea what I am doing. I have never dated a princess before. I barely know how to date regular people. Sarah laughed, the sound making the gardens sing in harmony. Neither of us knows what we are doing. We will figure it out together, like we figured out everything else. She was right, of course. They had built the impossible together. Surely navigating a relationship could not be harder than creating technology that had never existed before. Probably. Maybe. Ethan pulled her closer, carefully, still half afraid he might break something. Sarah came willingly, the exoskeleton responding smoothly to her intentions. They stood like that for a long moment in the singing garden, two people from different worlds who had found something neither had expected. We should probably tell your father, Ethan said finally, before he finds out some other way and decides to have me executed after all. Sarah grimaced. Yes, that conversation will be fun. She squeezed his hand. But not today. Today, I want to walk through these gardens with you and pretend we are just two normal people who happen to like each other. We are two normal people who happen to like each other, Ethan said. The fact that one of us is royalty and the other can barely afford rent is just details. Very large details, Sarah said, but she was smiling. Very well. Today we are just Sarah and Ethan, walking through a garden. And tomorrow? Ethan asked. Tomorrow we face reality, Sarah said. But I think we can handle it. We have faced bigger challenges. She was right. They had faced bigger challenges. Though Ethan suspected that navigating the politics of an imperial court while dating the princess was going to test his problem-solving skills in entirely new ways. But that was tomorrow's problem. Today, he had a beautiful woman who could walk for the first time in her life, and gardens that sang around them, and the satisfaction of knowing he had helped create something truly meaningful. He could worry about the rest later. Emperor Valendris did not take the news well. In fairness, Ethan had not expected him to. They had waited 3 days after Sarah's successful test, 3 days in which she practiced with the exoskeleton until she could walk almost normally, until the movements became natural enough that you might not even realize she was wearing assistive technology. Then Sarah had requested a private audience with her father, and Ethan had tagged along because apparently he was either very brave or very stupid, and nobody was quite sure which. The Emperor's private study was smaller than Ethan had expected, but no less intimidating. Every surface seemed to be made of materials that existed purely to demonstrate wealth and power. The walls pulsed with soft bioluminescence. The furniture looked like it had been grown rather than constructed, and the view through the massive windows showed the entire capital city spread out far below. Emperor Valendris sat behind a desk that seemed to be made of living wood and crystal, somehow merged into a single impossible structure. His eyes, still burning with that inner light, fixed on Ethan with an intensity that made him want to find somewhere to hide. So, the Emperor said, his voice carefully neutral. My daughter walks. This is remarkable. Revolutionary. You have accomplished what hundreds of our finest healers could not. He paused. And now you wish to court her. With your permission, your majesty, Ethan managed, his mouth dry. And if I do not give my permission? Emperor Valendris asked. What then? Sarah, standing beside Ethan with the exoskeleton hidden beneath elegant robes, lifted her chin. Then I will court him anyway, father. I have made my choice. The Emperor's expression flickered with something that might have been amusement or frustration or both. You have always been stubborn, daughter. Even as a child. He turned his burning gaze back to Ethan. Tell me, human, what are your intentions toward my daughter? Honestly, Ethan said, figuring that lying to an emperor was probably a bad idea. I have no idea. This is all completely new to me. But I care about her. A lot. And I want to try to make this work, whatever this is. You care about her, the emperor repeated. Many people care about her. That does not qualify you to court an imperial daughter. No, Ethan agreed. What qualifies me is that she wants this. That she chose me. And unless I am completely misunderstanding Valerian culture, she has that right. She does, Emperor Valendris admitted. Though the choice of an imperial daughter has political implications that extend far beyond personal preference. He stood, moving to the window to look out over his city. Do you understand what you are walking into, Ethan Cole? The scrutiny you will face? The expectations? The nobles who will see you as an upstart, a threat, or worse, an opportunity to manipulate? I am beginning to get an idea, Ethan said. But I am stubborn too. Comes with being a mechanic. We do not give up just because something is hard. The emperor was silent for a long moment. Then, without turning around, he said, My daughter has been trapped her entire life. Trapped by her body, trapped by her condition, trapped by the limitations everyone else placed on her. You freed her from that. You gave her mobility, independence, possibility. For that, I will always be grateful. He turned back to face them. But gratitude is not enough. If you are to be part of her life, part of my family, you must prove yourself worthy. Not to me, not to the court, but to yourself. You must be certain this is what you truly want, that you are prepared for everything it will entail. How do I prove that? Ethan asked. Time, the emperor said simply. Continue your work. Build more exoskeletons for others who need them. Show that your gift was not a singular achievement, but the beginning of something greater. Make a name for yourself that stands independent of my daughter's status. He paused. If, in 1 year's time, you still wish to pursue this relationship, and if my daughter still desires it, I will give my formal blessing. 1 year? Sarah said. Father, that is reasonable, the emperor interrupted gently. 1 year to ensure this is more than infatuation born of proximity and shared achievement. 1 year for Ethan to establish himself as more than the human who sat at the wrong table. He looked at Ethan. Is this acceptable to you? Ethan glanced at Sarah, who looked frustrated but resigned. She knew her father well enough to recognize when his mind was made up. Ethan turned back to the emperor. It is acceptable, your majesty. 1 year. I will make it count. See that you do, Emperor Valendris said. And Ethan, do not disappoint my daughter. She has experienced enough disappointment in her life. I will do my best not to, Ethan promised. As they left the study, Sarah walked beside him with growing confidence, the exoskeleton responding to her every intention. 1 year, she said quietly. He might as well have said a century. It will pass faster than you think, Ethan said. And he is not wrong. We need to be sure about this. Both of us. Plus, I could use the time to get my workshop into something resembling professional shape if I am going to be building more of these systems. You are really going to do this? Sarah asked. Build exoskeletons for others? Why not? Ethan said. The design works. The technology is proven. There have to be other people out there who could benefit from it, not just Valorians. Lots of species have mobility issues. We could help them. Sarah smiled. Then we will help them. Together. I will handle the medical side. You handle the engineering, and we will change lives. Is this going to be our thing? Ethan asked. Doing the impossible together? I think it already is, Sarah replied. The year that followed was the most challenging and rewarding of Ethan's life. With the Emperor's reluctant blessing and Sarah's enthusiastic partnership, they established what became known as the Mobility Project. The palace provided funding and facilities, Ethan provided engineering expertise, and Sarah coordinated the medical and research aspects. Word spread quickly through the medical community and beyond. Within a month, they had a waiting list of patients from a dozen different species, all hoping for a miracle similar to what Sarah had received. Each case was different, requiring custom solutions and countless hours of work. Ethan hired a team of engineers and technicians, teaching them the principles he had developed. The small lab grew into a full research and production facility. Some cases were easy, relatively speaking. A Bronther soldier who had lost mobility in his lower legs due to combat injury was walking again within 2 months. A Laminian elder whose species-specific condition had robbed her of flight regained her wings' function through a carefully designed support system. Each success felt like a victory, each patient's gratitude fueling Ethan's determination. Other cases were harder. Some patients' bodies rejected even the biosynthetic sensors. Some conditions were too complex for mechanical assistance to address. Ethan learned to handle failure, to tell people that he could not help them, to feel the weight of disappointed hope. Those nights were hard, and he often found himself in the palace gardens, talking with Sarah about the ones they could not save. Through it all, Sarah was his partner in every sense. She reviewed every design, consulted on every medical decision, and personally worked with many of the patients. She also continued to refine her own use of the exoskeleton, pushing its capabilities. 6 months into the year, she performed a traditional Valerian dance at a cultural festival, moving with grace that astounded everyone who saw it. The image of the imperial daughter dancing, her exoskeleton gleaming in the festival lights, became famous across the empire. But they kept their relationship strictly professional and public. No touching beyond what was necessary for work. No private meetings that could be misconstrued. They both felt the strain of it, but they had agreed to the emperor's terms. 1 year to prove themselves and their intentions. Ethan's workshop, meanwhile, evolved from a struggling one-man operation into something resembling a legitimate business. The fees from the mobility project patients who could afford to pay were more than enough to cover costs, and Ethan used the surplus to subsidize treatment for those who could not. His reputation grew. No longer just a grease monkey mechanic, he was now Ethan Cole, biomedical engineer, the human who had revolutionized mobility assistance. 10 months into the year, Ethan received an invitation to present their work at the Galactic Medical Consortium, the most prestigious medical gathering in known space. It was a huge honor and an incredible opportunity. He asked Sarah to co-present with him, and she immediately agreed. Together, they prepared a presentation showcasing not just the technology, but the patients whose lives had been transformed. The presentation took place in a massive amphitheater on the neutral station of Helios Prime. Thousands of medical professionals from hundreds of species watched as Ethan and Sarah explained their approach, showed videos of patients using the exoskeletons, and discussed the technical and medical challenges they had overcome. They ended with Sarah herself demonstrating the system, walking across the stage and performing a complex series of movements that showed its full capabilities. The ovation lasted for 5 minutes. Researchers and doctors swarmed them afterward, asking questions, requesting collaborations, offering funding for expansion. Ethan was overwhelmed, barely able to keep track of all the opportunities suddenly available. The mobility project was no longer just a noble effort, but a recognized leader in assistive technology. That night, after all the meetings and celebrations had finally ended, Ethan and Sarah found themselves alone on an observation deck overlooking Helios Prime's docking rings. The station rotated slowly, giving them an ever-changing view of docked ships and distant stars. "We did it," Sarah said quietly. "We really did it." "You did it," Ethan corrected. "This was always your dream. I just helped build the tools." "It was our dream," Sarah insisted. "Mine and yours." She turned to face him, and in the dim light of the observation deck, her crystalline skin seemed to glow from within. 2 months, Ethan. 2 months until the year is complete. Do you still want this? Want us? More than ever, Ethan said without hesitation. This year has just shown me how well we work together. How much better I am when you are part of my life. So yeah, I still want this. The question is, do you? Sarah's smile could have powered the entire station. I have wanted this since you sat down at my table by mistake and treated me like a person instead of a problem to be solved. Of course I still want it. Then we will tell your father, Ethan said. 2 months from now, exactly as agreed. And we will deal with whatever comes next. Whatever comes next, Sarah repeated. I like the sound of that. They stood together on the observation deck, watching ships come and go, and Ethan marveled at how much his life had changed in 1 year. He had started as a broke mechanic who accidentally sat at the wrong table. Now he was standing beside a princess, having just revolutionized an entire field of medicine, staring down a future that promised both incredible challenge and equally incredible reward. Not bad for a guy who mostly just fixed broken engines. The Emperor was waiting for them when they returned to Valoria, which would have been more ominous if he had not been smiling. It was not a large smile, barely a slight upturn of his lips, but for Emperor Valendris, it was practically beaming. "I watched your presentation," he said without preamble. "They broadcast it on the Imperial News networks. My advisors are very pleased. They say it has significantly enhanced Valoria's reputation across the galaxy." He paused. "I am pleased as well. You have exceeded my expectations, both of you." "Thank you, Father," Sarah said carefully. The Emperor nodded, then turned his burning gaze on Ethan. "You have made a name for yourself, human. Independent of my daughter, independent of your initial achievement. You are now recognized in your own right as an innovator and humanitarian." He stepped closer. "I also had you investigated. Very thoroughly. I know about every repair you have ever made, every debt you have paid, every person you have helped in your workshop when they could not afford proper service. You are exactly what you appeared to be, a decent man trying to do good work. That is rarer than you might think. I just try to help where I can, Your Majesty," Ethan said. "Which is precisely why you are worthy of my daughter," the Emperor said. He glanced at Sarah. "Though I notice you did not wait the full year before making your feelings public. We kept things professional," Sarah protested. "You stood very close together during the presentation," the Emperor observed. "You touched her shoulder when she stepped onto the demonstration stage. Small gestures, perhaps, but I know my daughter's body language. I know when she is happy." He paused. "I am glad she is happy. It has been too long." "So you approve?" Ethan asked, hardly daring to hope. "The year is not yet complete," the Emperor said, "but I see no reason to wait the remaining weeks. You have proven yourselves." He made a formal gesture, something in the Valerian style that Ethan's translator informed him meant official recognition. "I give my blessing to this union. Court my daughter, with the understanding that if you ever harm her, I will have you disassembled at a molecular level." "Understood, Your Majesty," Ethan said, trying not to think too hard about molecular disassembly. "Good," the Emperor said. "Now, I believe you two have work to do. I received 300 requests for consultation in the past 2 days alone. Your mobility project will need to expand significantly. We will handle it," Sarah assured him. "I know you will," the Emperor said. "You have both handled everything else." The next 5 years passed in a blur of activity and growth. The mobility project expanded from a single facility to a galaxy-wide organization with branches on dozens of worlds. Ethan and Sarah became recognized figures, their partnership legendary, their innovations continuing to push the boundaries of what was possible. They developed new versions of the exoskeleton, simpler models for basic mobility assistance, and more advanced systems for specialized applications. Athletes began using modified versions to enhance performance. Military organizations requested adaptations for combat applications, which Ethan and Sarah carefully screened to ensure they would only be used for defense and humanitarian operations. Through it all, their relationship deepened. They married in a ceremony that blended human and Valerian traditions, with Ethan's family traveling from Earth to witness their son marry a princess. Sarah walked down the aisle on her own feet, the exoskeleton hidden beneath elegant wedding robes, and the gardens sang as they exchanged vows. They had 2 children, a daughter and a son, both healthy and mobile. Ethan taught them to fix machines in his workshop, while Sarah taught them the responsibilities of leadership and compassion. The children grew up understanding that their mother's strength came not from denying her limitations, but from transcending them through determination and innovation. Emperor Valendris eventually stepped down from the throne, passing leadership to Sarah and Ethan as joint rulers. It was an unprecedented move, a human becoming co-emperor of the Valerian Empire, but the people had come to respect Ethan for his work and his character. Under their rule, the empire flourished, becoming known not for military might, but for humanitarian innovation and medical advancement. The Mobility Project became a permanent institution, outliving its founders and continuing their mission across generations. Millions of people across hundreds of worlds received the gift of mobility through their work. The technology continued to evolve, refined by new engineers and doctors who had been inspired by Ethan and Sarah's example. 30 years after accidentally sitting at the wrong table, Ethan stood in the singing gardens with Sarah, watching their grandchildren play among the harmonic plants. His hair had gone gray, and Sarah's crystalline skin had developed the subtle patterns that came with Valerian aging. But they still walked together, still worked together, still believed in the impossible. You know, Ethan said, watching their grandson chase after a butterfly. If my translator had worked properly that night, I never would have sat at your table. I would have ended up in some corner somewhere, probably left early, and none of this would have happened. Then I am grateful for faulty translators, Sarah said, taking his hand, and for human mechanics who do not know when to give up, and for the belief that sometimes the best things in life come from happy accidents. They were not accidents, Ethan said. They were possibilities waiting to be discovered. We just had to be brave enough to reach for them. The gardens sang around them as their grandchildren laughed, as the sun set over the capital city, as two people from different worlds stood together in the life they had built from a single moment of chance and choice. And that was the end of the story. If you listened all the way to here, don't forget to leave feedback about what you thought of the story in the comments, whether positive or negative. Your feedback helps us improve. Also, leave your like and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. And I'll leave here on the screen another video that I'm sure you'll like. Big hug, and see you in the next story.